We're in business to save the planet, and we use making clothes to do that. The cure for depression is action. Every one of us has to step up and do what you can according to what your resources are.
That was the voice of Patagonia's Yvonne Chenard, and this is Type 2, a podcast from Looking Sideways in association with Patagonia that explores the intersection between outdoors, action sports and activism. In each show, I'll be meeting people who are using their passion and involvement with the cultures we all love to create change. We'll be discussing the issues they're involved with, the change they're seeking to create, the difficulties involved and the rewards that follow. Now, my guest for this episode is Jack Harries. Jack is a filmmaker and environmental activist from London. He quickly came to prominence back in the day thanks to his wildly popular YouTube channel, Jack's Gap, which he started with his brother Finn, and which quickly amassed an impressive 4 million subscribers. Such an audience gave him quite a platform, as you might imagine, and quite a few opportunities, such as the chance to head to Greenland and take part in a documentary about glacial retreat. It would prove to be a life-changing moment for Jack, who decided from that point to dedicate his life to raising awareness of climate change and attendant issues such as forced migration. Now, he's done so by making documentaries in environmentally compromised places like Bhutan and Kiribati, through his work as an ambassador for organisations such as the WWF, and latterly by his very visible involvement with the Extinction Rebellion group. If anyone fulfills the premise of this podcast about using their platform to create change, it's Jack. And having been one of his 1.5 million Instagram followers for a while, I've been pretty intrigued by his story, to be honest. So with a fortnight of London-based Extinction Rebellion action in full swing in the middle of October 2019, I headed up to London to meet him and find out more. So here's how it went down, me and Jack Harries. Enjoy. How you doing? I'm with Jack. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks, man. Yeah. Happy to be here.
Thanks for seeing me. You've obviously had a pretty busy week. Well, few weeks.
2 weeks, a week and a half. Yeah. I feel sort of exhausted, but also exhilarated by the last week and a half.
Yeah. Well, you had some good news 2 days ago, right?
Yeah. 2 days ago, I was found not guilty in Westminster Magistrates Court. Which, do you know what it feels like? It feels a bit like getting your GCSE results. It's sort of been like hanging over me for 7 months. And
have you had the dreams that you've had an exam that you've not prepared for?
Exactly. Yeah. It's just this horrible tension. And I sort of like, lots of people ask me, how are you feeling about it? And I really was like, oh yeah, I'll be fine. Whatever the outcome, I've totally prepared myself for a criminal record or whatever. And then when I got the no guilty, I suddenly realised I think it had been really weighing on my shoulders a lot more than I thought it had.
And so can you explain why you were arrested?
Yeah, so that was back in February, I think it was. I took part in an action with Extinction Rebellion, the environmental protest group, outside the International Petroleum Conference in London. And it was an action in which 9 of us glued ourselves to the front doors of the hotel. The idea was to communicate with the delegates coming in that day. The International Petroleum Conference was something I'd never heard of before, but it runs 4 days every year. And on that particular day, they were meeting to discuss new exploration opportunities in West Africa. So obviously knowing that we're in the midst of a climate crisis and that we also have enough oil reserves already to burn the planet up 4 times over, seemed somewhat counterproductive.
Sure.
And so I was sort of moved just to go down, and it just seemed insane that this could continue in 2019 unchecked. Yeah. And so it felt important to go down and sort of be there just to voice my concerns. And I sort of just realised through that process that I'm a terrible environmental activist.
Right.
I've never been arrested before. You know, this stuff is really new to me, and I was terrified, frankly. You know, so I didn't put enough glue on my hands, and so this is how it went. Shall I explain you the action
go
a little
for
bit?
it. Please do.
This is how it happened. So we arrived at Green Park Station at around 8:30 in the morning, and I'd heard about the action the night before at an Extinction Rebellion press briefing. Where they sort of talked about the climate crisis and they were talking about the rebellion, which was the first major action they took in April. So this hadn't happened yet. Yeah. So you have to remember, Extinction Rebellion is only still 11 months old at this point.
That's what in researching this conversation, it's already such a part of the conversation, the culture. It's actually hard to believe it's not even a year old, is it? 'Cause, you know, I was almost like, oh yeah, that movement that's been around for years,
right?
And it is literally not even a year old.
Yeah, it seems like this thing that has existed forever, and it's
Yeah.
already sort of on Wikipedia as like, you know, one of the big social movements of the 21st century. And,
Sure.
And everyone seems to know its name, but literally 11 months ago it was founded. And I can talk more later about how that came to be, but this was one of our first actions in which we were sort of testing out, are people willing to be arrested for this cause? You know, how much are people willing to give to bring this issue to the public consciousness? And so I went down to this action, and I think I thought on that morning that I'd probably just take a photograph and sort of like
Right.
talk about the action and then just go back to my normal life. I certainly hadn't set out to be arrested. I hadn't had any of the trainings that I know the other activists had.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, if you don't mind me interrupting. Is that,
Go for it.
was it a tactic?
Yeah, so the idea behind Extinction Rebellion, one of the central ideas, is this idea of nonviolent civil resistance.
Yeah.
Which
being arrested
being arrested
is a
sort of
viable tactic, isn't
mainstay.
it? Yeah.
You know, the idea being that as long as you're willing to be arrested, then we're in a pretty great position for negotiation and to sort of hold the government accountable and yeah, so it's but I think for a lot of people it's wrapping their head around this idea of arrest. It is a scary thing.
Yeah, sure.
You know?
Well, you know, obviously you're brought up to it's a significant thing culturally,
right?
If you're law abiding,
right?
You know, it's a big step, isn't it?
Hugely.
So on that day you were not, it wasn't like it was planned you were going to go there and like be like, I'm going to get arrested, and
no, I hadn't.
So it unfolded as the day went.
Yeah, so it sort of, we arrived at the hotel early in the morning, and I watched initially as these 8 activists who called themselves the Arrestables, so they had very much committed to this act on that day, and I watched as they all each ran forward and glued themselves to the door,
right?
And sort of paint a picture. You know, this is like in this group of 8 people, there was a 23-year-old who'd recently graduated from Cambridge. There was a 73-year-old retired organic gardener. There was a guy called Yanai who trained as a barrister and is now a Buddhist. I mean, you know, the widest range of people you can imagine.
Sure.
For all intents and purposes, ordinary everyday people who have sort of read the science and are just terrified.
Yeah.
These aren't professional activists. For most of us, it was our first time ever crossing the boundaries of the law. And I watched as these people ran and glued themselves, and I don't know, there was just this feeling of like, I need to act, you know, like sort of solidarity, admiration, sadness a little bit. I watched as the security guards rushed over and dealt with the situation terribly. They sat on one of the activists as they tried to glue themselves to the door. And I just felt like if I want to stand for this issue, you know, which I do, then I have to involve myself here. And so I initially walked up to the main door and I just put my hand against it, just placed it against it. It was pathetic. You know, I just thought, what's the least I can do? I'm just going to put my hand against the glass, and everything calmed down. The security assumed, I guess, that we were all stuck, and they called the police. And it was the activist next to me, Yanai, who noticed that my hand wasn't actually stuck.
Right.
And he said, he was like, hey buddy, do you want some glue? And I was like, oh no, I don't know if I actually need the glue. And he's like, no one's got the main door, you know, because we were there to really try and get all the doors, you know, take some glue and go for it. And again, there was that feeling of like, this is my purpose, I've got to do this. And so I took the glue and I went and actually stuck myself to the door. And then I realized I needed a wee. And I was like, shit, I didn't think, can I swear on this? Or crap,
you can swear away.
I didn't think about this one. And so then that became a whole predicament. And it's just sort of realizing how horribly unprepared I was for this. And, you know, how amateur we all were, I suppose. Anyway, long story short, eventually my hand came off the door. I think probably because my hand was sweating so much. So I was so sort of nervous. And so then I had to pretend it was still stuck. And eventually the policeman who had arrived, PC Cambry, was the guy that was tasked with keeping an eye on me. He noticed my hand wasn't stuck. I dropped my sign and I, without thinking, leant down to pick it up and used both my hands. And he just looked at me like, this is clearly your first time.
This is your first gluing.
And he stepped forward and put the cuffs on my wrists and then took me to West End Central Police Station and so then I had all those thoughts of like, what have I done? This is really serious. And you know,
so did that action take you personally by surprise, if that doesn't sound like too strange a question? Because obviously with your background there's been a building up to this involvement, this moment, if you like. You know, you've documented it really clearly, and I hate to use the word journey, but I'm going to use it. You know, like the way that it's been a progression. To your involvement
massively.
So, and you say that you'd not planned it. So, did that level of commitment that you'd shown, did that surprise you that you'd actually, or did it make a kind of sense?
I think it made sense ultimately, but at the time it felt scary. And of course, I suppose it's probably ridiculous to think that you can go and glue yourself to a door and not risk getting arrested. You know, it would have been naive to presume that wouldn't have likely led to that happening. So, but yeah, it was just a bit of a shock initially, I suppose. But now I look back and, you know, I feel really proud of having taken that action. And I think that it has had an impact. You know, it's given me a platform to speak more about these issues. And I think it's helped other people as well be able to take this decision. And it's a huge decision to be arrested. And it also has to be said as well that, you know, arrest affects different demographics differently, right? I have to acknowledge my own privilege in being able to take that risk of going and getting arrested.
It's perhaps less risky than for the demographic.
Totally.
Let's say.
It's not something to glamorize at all. But for me, I felt like I had that privilege, and that felt like a responsibility for me to use it in a sense, you know. And anyway, so yeah, that was the action we took, and we were all charged initially with criminal damage and aggravated trespass. The damage for the gluing and the trespass for being there on that private property. And we've been in and out of courts for 7 months now. And again, you know, it's really impacted my life. I've lost jobs as a result of it, and I know many of the other defendants have too.
Yeah.
And so that's been a learning process as well. And 2 days ago, we had our final day in court, in which I was found not guilty, which was, as I said, a huge relief. And 5 of us were found not guilty in total, and 4 were found guilty of trespass. So
what have they been sentenced?
Yeah, they've been sentenced with a 12-month conditional discharge, which is like a temporary criminal record. It's a sort of motivation to not reoffend within that time. So it's probably the least you can get without just being totally discharged.
Did you expect to be found not guilty?
No, not at all. I absolutely went in that day expecting to be found guilty.
Right.
The judge hadn't been particularly friendly or understanding, and it's just so infuriating when you're sat in that courtroom talking about the minutiae of, you know, whether your hand was actually stuck to this door, and you're trying to remind him of the much broader theme of climate change and the reasons we were there, and, you know, the ridiculousness for prosecuting those trying to stop what is absolutely criminal activity that was happening inside that room. I mean, it's certainly not recognised that legally now, but, you know, I think one day we'll recognise that as genocide. That probably sounds really extreme, but, you know, if you read the science, that's what burning fossil fuels is doing.
Well, that's the Extinction Rebellion versus mainstream opinion debate in microcosm, isn't it? Basically, you know, because you hear the arguments about wasting police time and, you know, like bringing the city to a halt, and the mainstream view of like why this is actually to be pilloried and should be punished, and then obviously the view that you're putting forth, which is actually essential and is needed to give this debate the platform that it needs, right?
Totally, yeah. There's 2 sort of central criticisms of Extinction Rebellion. One is this one of hypocrisy.
Yeah,
so,
which you get asked about a lot.
Yeah.
And which we should discuss because it is interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and it's a really important thing to discuss, I think.
Yeah.
You know, Piers Morgan, for example, is really keen to point out that any protest around the streets is a hypocrite because they have television.
It's the same argument though, isn't it? Like logical fallacy of like U2, basically. You know, like it's... And, you know, George Monbiot's been talking about it all week, hasn't he, on Twitter, for example. Like... And every person I've ever interviewed on this show, and probably will ever interview, you know, it comes up because people grapple with it, don't they? And yeah, you know, like like I say, you've been asked it a lot. Like it is basically the main tool, isn't it, that the establishment, if you like, throws back in the face of this kind of position, let's say. Totally,
and I think it's just another form of denialism. It's very easy to sort of say, well, you're a hypocrite, so why should we listen to you? And it just seems like a totally irrelevant argument to me. If you have to be a perfect environmentalist to have this conversation, then no one's going to have this conversation. I think that's why we've stalled on this issue for 30 years so far. And for me, you know, that's almost the most hypocritical thing for someone like Piers Morgan to say, oh, I recognise there's an emergency, I recognise there's a climate crisis, but I'm not going to talk about it because I've got a TV or something. I mean,
well, it's Julie Hartley-Brewer on Question Time last week, same shit, you know, basically like, no, I believe the science,
right?
But I don't. But what I don't, it's the approach, it's the it's the fact that they're in McDonald's, they're this, that, and the other.
Right.
But it doesn't actually have any impact on the argument, does it?
No, absolutely not. And yeah, of course, we all need to look at our own individual actions, and that's something that we all need to work on. But we also need system change. You know, it's impossible to exist within the system we have and be a sort of perfect environmentalist, and that's the very crux of the problem. So,
how do you reconcile it personally? And again, I know you've been asked this very frequently, but
you mean, what do I do in my personal life?
Yeah, reconcile the contradiction, hypocrisy, the charge that is thrown against people like yourself that are, you know, that you're a hypocrite, basically.
Right. I mean, it's just something I've sort of come to get used to, I suppose. You know, I've made changes in my own life. I have a plant-based diet. I have done 5 years. I've massively reduced flying and sort of working to totally cut that out of my life. But it doesn't affect me. I'm not going to not have this conversation because I'm a hypocrite. I mean, I think the best thing is just acknowledge it. Like, I'm a hypocrite. Of course, I'm absolutely a hypocrite. We are all hypocrites. We're all complicit within this system.
Well, I liked Nonviolent's thing where he basically said there's two types of people in the world: there's hypocrites and cynics, and I'd rather be a hypocrite. Basically.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I think we just have to move. I hope that's something we move past, you know, this sort of finger pointing and blame.
I think we will, and it's almost why I bring it up, because I think, and it's the reason why I ask people every episode, because I think the more that people get used to hearing that argument is basically bullshit and it can be ignored, because also it's a shaming argument, isn't it? You know, it's an argument to make people to sort of play on people's sense of shame to stop them from taking action. So the more you can, people like yourself can just say, yeah, whatever, I'm going to ignore that.
Right.
The more quickly that'll be debunked, I think, really.
It just sort of feels like not relevant to me, because what I see is the purpose of Extinction Rebellion is we're elevating a message, right?
Yeah.
And that message is what we're being told by scientists, what we're reading from scientists, right? So to me, it's sort of like going to the doctor and your doctor saying, you've got pancreatic cancer and you've got a few months to live. And it's like going, A, oh, that's really inconvenient, and B, well, also, haven't you smoked cigarettes and drunk alcohol? It's like, well, yeah, but like, I'm just giving you this message, you know, and it doesn't change the message. And that's how I see it. Like, yes, I'm a hypocrite, but it doesn't change the fact that we have this devastating prognosis from scientists, and we need to be talking about this. And we need to be accepting our own hypocrisy, and we need to be moving past that and collectively understanding how we're going to unite behind this science.
So you mentioned 2 charges against Extinction Rebellion, the first one being the hypocrisy. So how would you characterise the second?
So hypocrisy, and then just this idea that it's sort of inconvening people's lives in the immediate sense. The idea that people can't get to hospital, or, you know...
clog up the courts.
Right, clogging up the courts and things.
Or
that taking away valuable police time from knife crime and things. And these are the things I've sort of been accused of, like live on the news and things. And you know, I understand all those concerns. They're certainly valid. You know, I think the first point to make is that it goes without saying, none of the Extinction Rebellion people want to be out in the streets doing this. You know, I had an entire plan for my life that didn't involve getting arrested and being an activist. And we can say the same for all the kids that are out every Friday, you know, that like these kids are giving up their education because they're worried they literally won't have a future. You know? They don't want to be doing this. And so I think that's the first thing to say. And then the other, you know, is like, to use another analogy, and I think analogies are really helpful when we talk about this thing. You know, the way I think about Extinction Rebellion is like a fire alarm that's going off in a house. You know, it's loud, it's inconvenient. We'll probably have to stop what we're doing and go stand outside in the cold. It might make you make you sick or whatever, you know, but it's necessary to save your life. And so it's this sort of temporary inconvenience that is protecting a much greater good. And I think that's how we have to see Extinction Rebellion. And I think if you haven't read the science, if you don't understand the severity of the crisis, it does seem over the top, and it does seem annoying and frustrating. But you have to look at the much broader context of the issue, I think.
Yeah, because I think there's definitely a fairly willful head in the sand approach, isn't there? Which is, to be honest, ideological, isn't it? Really, you know, in terms of like the way that the media portrays it and the way that it is dismissed as like the kind of, you know, like the Greta Thunberg thing, and it's like, oh, she's just scaring people, and it's like panic mongering, and you know, like all that kind of stuff. That isn't, again, that's not actually an argument. That's not actually like a grappling with the facts on offer or the argument. It's basically another almost like kind of diversionary tactic, isn't it?
Something that's really fascinating, I always think, with this conversation is you look at, what is it, the 5 stages of grief.
Yeah.
And I can't remember off the top of my head what they are, but
No, I know what you mean. Yeah.
I think one of the first one is denial.
Yeah.
And then
rage is in there.
Bargaining is one.
Yeah.
And then acceptance is the final one.
Yeah.
And you really see this play out. I've been through it myself. You know, when I first read this stuff and I first went to Greenland and I saw what was happening, I was like, this is not going to affect our life, surely. You know, there's my denial. And then it's like, well, okay, well, we've got like 20 years to figure this out, right? There's your bargaining. And we see this play out in the news. And so when I see people like Piers Morgan and characters like that, I don't think it's surprising. I think it's just, unfortunately, part of the process.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you, actually, in relation to where Extinction Rebellion's at now, because obviously the other significant thing that's happened this week is that it's been banned across London, and the police have invoked fairly scary,
draconian,
arbitrary powers, really.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, like what you could consider undemocratic actions.
Absolutely.
But do you feel that escalation is also necessary? Is that almost like expected?
Yes, and I think if you speak to some of the people inside Extinction Rebellion who are in charge of the tactics, the young guy called Joel, who's sort of been, you know, one of the main organisers of the last rebellion, he'll say that's absolutely part of the tactics, and I see it working. You know, as the police try to combat this disruption, they get more and more sort of authoritarian, and then people turn against them. And you think, well, this isn't a democracy, rightly so.
Yeah.
And so then people start to side more with Extinction Rebellion, and I think that's all planned into the tactics. You know, I have a lot of respect for the police personally in the way that I've seen them handle the streets, and I think that has to be recognised. But I've also seen some really horrible sort of miscarriages of justice, and you know, I saw a man get his finger broken on the first day of the rebellion last week, and they definitely need to sort of check themselves in this process of handling it. And I think as we see it escalate and they take more and more sort of draconian rule, that people will side more and more with Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah. Well, there are precedents, aren't there, in terms of movements? You know, are Extinction Rebellion taking any previous non-violent movements as a kind of blueprint, do you know, or a model?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose on this note, we should talk a little bit about how Extinction Rebellion came to be. So it was founded by a man called Roger Hallam, and I met Roger a year and a half ago. I was making a short film about air pollution in London, and I read about this man called Roger who'd been shutting down roads for like 5 minutes at a time to protest air pollution. And I thought that's sort of interesting and making an interesting part of the film. And so I went and met Roger. And at the time, he was doing a PhD in civil resistance at King's College London. He was studying social movements and what makes them effective. And he was testing out some of his theories by going and blocking roads. And I went to one of these actions he put on, and it was really tragic. It was like sort of 4 or 5 retirees stepping into the road in West London and just getting shouted at by drivers. And I sat Roger down in an interview and I said, what are you hoping to achieve with all this, Roger? And he said, I've got this plan. I'm going to have thousands of people in the streets of London protesting climate change. And on the day, I was like, oh, right, yeah. Good luck with that. Yeah, that sounds...
You got a long way to go, mate.
Yeah. Keep me updated on that one.
Yeah.
And I sort of went off, and 2 months later, Roger, along with a few friends, registered his organisation, and he called it Extinction Rebellion.
Right.
And I saw George Monbiot write about it, actually. And then I emailed Roger again and was like, Roger, I think we should meet again. And so I've sort of witnessed the birth of it, and it very much, it was a product of studying, as you sort of touched on there, social movements of the past. And we look back at, at social movements, Gandhi, Parks, King, Mandela, civil resistance has been used time and time again to great effect. And often as well, what we forget is at the time, these movements were incredibly controversial.
Yeah, of course.
These people were hated. They were considered terrorists.
Yeah.
They were put in prison. Suffragettes would smash windows, be taken to prison, go on hunger strike, and go back and smash the same windows, and they died.
And had, let's not forget, had the full power of the establishment press against them as well.
Right.
If you look back at, for example, you make the point, but anti-suffragette propaganda,
right,
or probably would be considered a strong word, but it's really brutal.
Totally.
It's actually horrifying when you think what the cause was.
Right. Yeah. Horrendous. But we look back now and we clearly see suffragettes as the heroes.
It's the old right side of history thing, isn't it?
And so I think in the moments where where I'm sort of being arrested and I feel, have I gone too far? Have I made a bad mistake? Or we're out on the streets and it feels heavy, or you see this criticism online. I have to just remember that and hope that one day we'll look back and understand the importance of this. And I think if we're not pissing people off to some degree, we're probably not doing enough.
Yeah.
And Gail Bradbrook, who's the other founder of Extinction Rebellion, often says you don't have to like the movement. We're not after everyone to love the movement. It has to work. People have to just come down. And there's a great statistic by a woman called Erica Chenoweth, who's an American political scientist, and she did a great talk about why civil resistance works. And in it, she said it takes 3.4% of a population to tip the scales to create meaningful social change. And so if you look at the UK, there's just over 66 million people in the UK. That means we need 2 million people to put themselves forward and be counted. And it doesn't necessarily mean arrested. That just means out on the streets, visible and being counted, which doesn't seem like a crazy amount of people to me.
No.
And so that's what we need. We don't need everyone in the country to love Extinction Rebellion and think it's fantastic. That will never happen. But we need 2 million people to sort of get behind the cause. And I think, honestly, we're sort of getting there. It's amazing to see how the movement has grown in 11 months.
Yeah. Well, we should talk about your own path to this. Definitely not going to use the word journey again, because you touched upon it earlier.
Yeah.
Because and again, you've documented it. You had a trip to Greenland through your work that was very significant for you. So could you explain a little bit about where this sort of germ came from for you of an idea and how you've ended up in this position?
Yeah, my path, not journey.
Yeah. Slash journey. Yeah. X Factor's got a lot to answer for.
This is my sob story.
I'll overdub the kind of music.
So some nice music.
The R tune music. Yeah.
So my journey's technically started when I was 14. My mum was a climate activist. She ran a group called Climate Action Now. It's just like a local group. And there was a time where there were lots of colourful characters coming around to our house making banners and things. And I actually remember one night where she was dressed as a suffragette on her way out to the Houses of Parliament. And she took my brother and I aside and she said, boys, mummy may be arrested tonight, but don't worry, I'll be home in time for breakfast. And so from a young age, I suppose this idea of fighting for what you believe in and the environment was sort of drilled into my brother and I. I'm an identical twin, so we sort of grew up aware of these issues together. But obviously at that age, I was sort of being dragged to these protests and I just thought it was so boring, And I think that's the other thing we're seeing change is, I don't know about you guys, when I was at school, the environment was lame to care about the environment. That wasn't something cool at all.
No, it's definitely a minority interest.
Totally. And I think also the other thing that switched is we saw it as the environment, whereas now I think to care about climate change is to care about the future of humanity. It's a human issue, right? The planet's going to be fine.
It's very issue based. I think previously, particularly when I was younger, it was the groups that had visibility were very single issue focused.
Yeah.
I've covered Surfers Against Sewage, for example, a lot on this podcast and generally, and that's kind of what I knew about growing up as in being into surfing, snowboarding, skateboarding. But those were the visibility, like you say, the idea that it's actually a critical human story is quite new, I think.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's something we're only just beginning to understand. That's the sort of big flipping switch. It's not really even about single-use plastics, though that's massively important, or picking up rubbish. It's about, do we want to have a future on this planet as humanity?
So what changed it for you then? At what point did you start to...
So I sort of, was brought up with that stuff and then promptly forgot about it throughout my teenage years, had other things on my mind. And then I left school at 18, took a year off, and I'd been watching a lot of YouTube videos as a form of procrastination, I guess, throughout my A-levels. And this was back in 2011, and I sort of you have to remember then YouTube was a really different place and no one was making any money. It was a lot of cats and dogs on skateboards, but I sort of saw that there were people who were setting up channels and they were they were running their own shows from their bedroom, and to me that just seemed so exciting. And so on the first day of my year off, I created a YouTube channel as just a fun experiment of you've got this bit of time, see what I can do with this, and just as a creative project. And that became my sort of focus throughout my year off, and sort of grew totally unexpectedly. I left. I went to university in 2012, and I left a month later to do this thing full time, and it sort of grew to 100,000 subscribers, 1 million subscribers, 2 million subscribers, and was totally overwhelming. But obviously at the time, also really exciting. Just like running this thing from our bedroom, and offered my brother and I the creative freedom just to start to make films and talk about things we were passionate about and share them with an audience. Just to stop
you there, did the filmmaking, was that it's difficult to probably separate the two, considering you were young when this started, but was that an interest that you had, as like you wanted to tell stories and make films?
I grew up in a sort of family of filmmakers or storytellers to some degree, so it was like always something that was around, and my brother and I would just always get up to a lot of mischief making short films as kids, and so it was always an outlet. It was always an outlet, and probably a terrible idea to then start sharing that online. I look back at a lot of that stuff and I cringe so much, but it was just total
that's healthy
youthful naivety, I think, and creative freedom. Had no idea that they would gain an audience, or anything. It was just like a sort of creative outlet, as you say. But a major turning point was the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, approaching us, and they sort of saw we were making these films, and they said, how would you like to go to Greenland and make a documentary about glacial retreat? And at the time I knew nothing about what was happening in Greenland, really. It seemed like this really exciting opportunity, and so we went on this trip, and we joined a science research trip to Greenland, and we spent a night. We dropped off in the Jakobshavn Glacier. It's the fastest retreating glacier in the world, and we went with a scientist called Alan Hubbard, and he was retrieving data from the Extreme Ice Survey, which is this group of cameras set up on the glacier, which is sort of photographing it every few hours, and it's how they monitor its change over a period of time. And long story short, they were observing that these glaciers were just melting at an unprecedented rate and falling into the ocean beneath.
Was this shot in the film, isn't there, of like the Manhattan overlay, where that carbon event is because I actually watched it again the other day, and it is horrifying, really. It is. You can casually throw that around. There's an iceberg the size of Manhattan that's just fallen off this glacier. But I imagine seeing that in up front is fairly affecting.
I think for me, the biggest issue with climate change is that it's not very tangible. It's invisible,
especially not in our little
if you live in a city world. Or you live in the UK. It happens in faraway places, and it's often complicated by graphs and numbers. I think that's why I failed to ever grasp it. But you put someone on a glacier and you stand there as you watch huge pieces of it fall into the ocean beneath. You get it. It's like you feel it, you see it, and so for me it was like it just all clicked into place, and I sort of was able to tangibly see how the planet was changing because of the increasing temperatures, and it was that night literally I just realized that this would be the most important issue of our lifetime, and just decided that's what I wanted to commit myself to. I had no idea how to do that, but I just thought this is the story I want to tell, and I wanted to tell how it was affecting humans around the world as well, because I think that's the important link to make, is how does that melting glacier affect me in my life? Why should I care, frankly? And so since that date, I've been fortunate with various NGOs and stuff to travel to Somaliland during a devastating drought to witness, climate refugees traveling hundreds of miles for clean water and food. I've travelled to Kiribati, which is a remote island nation in the South Pacific, which is one of the lowest lying countries in the world and is under threat from rising sea levels, and the very rising sea levels that's being caused by those melting glaciers. As you start to put the pieces together, and I literally watched as men and women rebuilt their sea walls there, and I learned about the president's plan to buy land in Fiji to mass migrate the entire population, and most recently I went to Borneo to go and understand the effect of forest fires on the orangutan population. And so these, and I have to acknowledge as well at this point that my carbon emissions have probably single-handedly contributed to the climate crisis, and that's something that an inner contradiction I'm working on as well. That there's a horrible irony to flying around the world to report on climate change, which I realise, and this has happened over 5 years as well. This isn't sort of something that happened in a year, but these various trips have just helped me as a filmmaker and a photographer understand these issues and understand the human issues and meet the people being affected. And I think above anything else, it's taught me that climate change isn't just an environmental issue, that it's really an issue of human rights and social justice, because it's those who have done the least to impact the climate who are suffering the most, right? It's those in the global south who are suffering at the effect of our sort of carbon intensive lifestyles, which is a horrible injustice.
Well, as you mentioned, migration is probably one of the consequences that is least spoken about.
Totally.
But when even now, like, migration has such a huge effect on our you can see the effect that's having on our own political
just the Syrian refugee crisis, which was
or like
1 million people.
Yeah, exactly. And even like immigration through Europe, let's say, which isn't particularly, it's political, not environmental, but you know, the effect that has on our own standard of living, as we can see now in our own political debate and dialogue, you know, the repercussions clearly are going to be vast globally, because these issues, like you said, they're human issues ultimately, they're not environmental issues.
Absolutely.
And they're another thing that aren't spoken about. So you've consciously tried to use your platform and your work to highlight these human consequences, if you like.
Yeah, just to sort of communicate that human story in the hope that just helps illustrate these issues, because you know, like, science doesn't come naturally to me, you know, so I sort of know firsthand how hard it is to understand these issues and to sort of cut through all that jargon. And so that was the thinking, was if I could sort of find the human stories, the very base stories that we can all relate to, that might help bring this issue alive. And going on those journeys and seeing the reality of the effects of climate change is ultimately what drove me towards activism, you know, because I have to be honest and say that it's left me feeling terrified. You know, I haven't sort of gone on these trips and thought like, oh, well, it's a bad issue, but we've probably got it under control. Yeah, it's devastating, it's terrifying, and I don't see anything more important right now than activism, than taking to the streets to change the very system by which we live that is driving us into this crisis. You know, we've known about this issue for 30 years, or fossil fuel companies have, at least anyway, and they have consistently invested in campaigns to confuse the public and to hide the information. And we're at a really key point in history right now. You know, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released this report last year. It was very widely publicised that we have 12 years, now 11, to radically transform all aspects of society if we want a chance at a habitable future. That's sort of summing it up in a very brief way, but we have 12 years to limit temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees. And so we have this like very, very small window in which to prevent a sort of devastating, catastrophic climate change, and it's an insurmountable task. And I think that everyone with a platform has the responsibility to be talking about this issue, and to be taking out to the streets as well. You know, and we see every Friday kids skipping school to protest this issue, and I think there's a danger of being like, oh, that's great, the kids are taking this issue on. You know, it's devastating. The responsibility is falling on the shoulders of like 16-year-olds to tackle this issue. And I just think adults need to back up their children and follow suit, you know, and support them out on the streets.
Do you feel positive about the future?
I feel a mix. It depends on the day, you know, but I think what makes me feel positive is the activism that we're seeing, this sort of fire that we're seeing. I went to a great talk last night by Naomi Klein, and she talked about who wrote The Shock Doctrine and This Changes Everything and No Logo, and these seminal books about capitalism, climate change. And she spoke about there being three fires right now: the sort of fire of what's happening in our environment, the fire of what's happening politically, which is obviously linked to this move towards right-wing populism, but then this sort of third fire of like activism, this sort of sea change that we're seeing with the school strikes, with Extinction Rebellion. And that's what gives me hope. You know, I think people absolutely are waking up, and we have a long way to go. And I think that my lifetime is going to be one of tremendous amounts of change, you know, that we can't even imagine. But we've got to give it a shot. You know, I think without hope, this sort of hatred fills that space. You know, hope combats all the hatred that we see in the world. I think that's a result of this crisis that's looming.
I mean, that's why I asked the question, really, because this debate does unleash the ugliest side of human nature as well, doesn't it, really? You know, like, as we've kind of touched upon, even to the point of mentioning a few individuals or whatever. And, you know, obviously you've been really eloquent in kind of putting the the other side of the case forward publicly, whether it's through media appearances or your own platform. But it is a pretty vicious fight. You know, like there's a lot of unscrupulous arguments out there. So that's why I asked, because sometimes it can feel like that, you know, you're fighting the worst of humanity in a way, you know, like even, you know, like you say, the actual approach from the fossil fuel industry to like increase production in the face of this.
I think what we need to do, and I think we could do this better as a movement of Extinction Rebellion, and we need a new narrative, right? So tackling climate change shouldn't be about people having to make these sort of sacrifices in their life. It shouldn't be about you know, the most disadvantaged in society suffering. This is an opportunity to create a new system that benefits everyone. You know, I think this is what excites me about the Green New Deal. You know, it's which we're seeing talked about a lot in the States by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And it's now come over to the UK. There's Labour for a Green New Deal is something that's being spoken about a lot. And this idea of a Green New Deal is, let's take this opportunity, this incredible time in history, to totally reimagine our entire economy.
It's a positive story.
And the way we do things, and tell a new positive story. Yeah. And I think until we successfully tell that story, the masses aren't going to get behind this issue.
I was going to ask you that, because ultimately you need to capture centre ground, don't you? You know, like, you've got the right wing elements that we've been talking about, and then you've got the let's call it the left wing elements that perhaps is where we're positioned.
Sure.
But the middle ground is who you need to persuade, and that's who your Piers Morgans are talking to, and that's who your Boris Johnson's referring to Extinction Rebellion as crusties are talking to. And the middle ground is susceptible to those kind of dog whistle top line arguments. And I do agree, really. You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because I do think, when I look at it, I think a simple positive message is really essential, isn't it, to win that middle ground, which is what's ultimately going to win the argument, unfortunately, because that is what creates change, when you get that centre opinion behind it, isn't it? Like you've seen, trivially you could say, with single-use plastic. You know, you've now got the Daily Mail like behind it, because it's become, you know, like a vote winner. Essentially the government are behind it, because they understand that middle ground can get behind that issue.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that with the environment. You know, I think we've got an election coming up at some point soon here in the UK, and it's absolutely going to be, you know, a mainstay issue. And I think if Extinction Rebellion have achieved one thing, I think it's, you know, hate them or love them, they've managed to get this issue to the forefront of public conversation. You know, I think it's considered to be the third most important issue for the British population. You know, 70% of the population believe that climate change is the most important issue. Don't quote me on those statistics, but you know, it's massively become an important issue for at least the British population over the last year, and I think that, you know, that means we're going to see that reflected in our politics. You know, which is the only way we're going to start to see changes.
So what would you say to people listening to this that are on the fence, or that are even inspired to take action but not too sure how they can, you know, help be this positive movement? Like what piece of advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say obviously search out Extinction Rebellion. There's local groups all across the UK, and I think that something I see so often is people make an opinion of Extinction Rebellion, perhaps because they've read it in a certain newspaper, and then they come down to the events, and every single time people are just blown away by the atmosphere at the events. You know, take the April Rebellion, which was just 2 weeks in London. I mean, the people that were there, we had the best time of our lives. It was an amazing atmosphere. It was a celebration of life and community, and in many ways Extinction Rebellion is sort of modelling the type of future that we'll need to see to get through what's coming, you know, which is coming together, community, singing, sharing food. Yeah, I sort of think in that sense rebellion is probably the wrong word. It doesn't really capture the atmosphere. And so in that sense, you know, come down to one of these events and you can play whatever role it is that's comfortable to you. You certainly don't have to be arrested. You know, whilst thousands have been arrested in the name of Extinction Rebellion, tens of thousands have been there in the offices just sort of doing admin or making placards or making food or, you know, whatever it is. And there's so much room to get involved. And I think that it just is an amazing feeling to come together in this time as a community and realize there are other people who recognize the issue in the same way you do and are committed to building a better world. You know, it's you can't leave one of these events without feeling uplifted in some way. And in a time where religion isn't really a sort of mainstay anymore, I think many people are looking for this sort of purpose and this community. And I think Extinction Rebellion offers an element of that, that we could probably all benefit from in this crazy age of being totally disconnected from one another.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think you can see that's what a lot of people are getting at. This is the sense of community, basically, and it's and the empowering feeling of the fact you are doing something positive, which is, let's be honest, really important.
And it can be really overwhelming in this issue. I think that's the other one. Well, what can I do? How can I make a difference? And I think it gives a way to make a difference, even in just the smallest way, coming down. And maybe it's just supporting someone who's been arrested. When I got out the cell when I was arrested, there were 6 people there, just to sort of like, hey, you're right, offer support, bit of food, and then that makes all the difference. So all roles are massively important within the movement.
And what's next for you?
What is next for me? It's a good question. As I spoke about earlier, I'm sort of stopping flying. I recognise that's a thing I need to change in my own life, and so that feels like an importance.
Big step for what you do, right?
Yeah, personally, but there feels like there's so much going on here, right on my doorstep, and that feels really exciting. So I'm just sort of committed to becoming a bigger part of that. Yeah. And then we were speaking about, just before we started this, I'm also going to start a podcast. Yeah. Because I just feel like the world doesn't have enough podcasts.
Yeah, I recommend it. Yeah.
I just, through this process of getting much more involved in activism over the last year, I've been lucky to meet so many really inspiring people who have just changed my view on the world, and I'd love to just sit down and talk to those people, and that feels like something's very achievable. So I'm going to be focusing my time on that over the next few months.
Great. Well, thank you. That was really great.
Thanks so much for having me.
I really enjoyed it.
Real
Thanks.
Pleasure.
So there you go. That was my episode of Type 2 with Jack Harries. I hope you enjoyed it. Got to admit, by the time our conversation had finished, I had a little bit of a man crush on Jack, who, as well as being young, talented and devilishly attractive, is also completely charming and hospitable. If you want to find out more about what he does, you can follow him on Instagram or check out his work over at www.jacksgap.com. There's some great work on there, and you can find the films that we referenced during our conversation. Thanks for listening. I'll be releasing new episodes of Type 2 every month or so. They will appear in my usual Looking Sideways channel, which you can subscribe to via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your usual podcast purveyor. If it's your first time checking out what I do, make sure you get stuck into the back catalogue. There's over 100 episodes of interviews with some of the biggest names in action sports on there. Full show notes. It's all completely free of adverts. Not a square space in sight. I reckon you'll enjoy it. Thanks for listening, and hopefully I'll see you again. Nice one.